training. We're about to look at the identity, governance, privacy, and compliance features in Azure. And the first session would describe the Azure identity. So I just want to go over that module really quick and then we just get started with that particular module. So this is the session objective for this model. We're going to be looking at the identity itself. We're going to explain the difference between authentication and authorization. Then I'm going to be talking about Active Directory, AD for short, and identity and access management. Then we're going to talk about role single sign-on, SSO for short, multi-factor authentication, and conditional access. And I would plays a role into the broader identity structure. So let's get started. Now let's talk about identity. Identity has to do with your actual credentials, your authenticating and authorizing individuals, devices, and application for use in Azure. So identity is a broader part of the entire defense in-depth structure on strategy. So we're going to take a look at identity in detail. So let's talk about authentication. It ensures the user, the service or device is well known. So service include application and provide the required credential to legitimize access so you could move on to the authorization part of it. Now authorization build on the authenticity of the party or the device or the application, and it leverages the need based on the role that is assigned to the that authorization. So you do own the resource. You want to make sure that you only have read-only access to that particular resource, that is the only access that you are able to use. So it actually controls the role and the accessibility or the authorization level that you would have for that particular resource that you're requesting access to. Now let's take a general look at authentication just to get an overview as to how it works. And this is what authentication involves. It would be your username and your password, your credentials to log in. And then once you're authorized, you will have access to different resources like your app services, to data. So this is where the read only will come in, and then the actual access control would come in at that point as well. So that's the ability for you to be able to do that. Okay, so that is a general understanding of the authentication and authorization process. Just a graphical user interface overview so you could understand the concept a little better. Now let's move on and look at Active Directory. So Active Directory is responsible for your identity in Azure. It is similar to the Active Directory that you would use on premises. So you're using it for over 2 decades now, I think it is, from Windows 2000. So AD fulfills the identity posture of the Azure security structure in detail. And this is a graphical overview. As you can see, you could still use it on premises to fulfill your identity needs, and you can also use it in conjunction with your Azure presence as well. So you get the single sign-on, you get the multi-factor authentication, and you get self-services with it. So Active Directory, you can use it to maintain identity posture for both your on-premises and your Azure cloud presence as well. So I just want you to understand that. Now AD also support SSO, single sign-on, and it is really a powerful feature in the identity model. It allows you to be able to sign on to a resources with just one set of credential, so you won't have to log into different resources multiple times if you have more than one credential on a particular system. Now you can use AD for the cloud and on-prem as well, as I mentioned. AD can also be used to authenticate access to application and resources over the internet. You could also use AD. It helps you to manage your devices. You'd have to register those devices in Intune, and we'll talk about that downstream when we get to that point as well. Now let's take another look at the authentication. Authentication not only verifies our identity, it can manage healthy procedures such as routine password reset. You could use it to set up your password so they're reset every 30 days or at a particular interval. And it comes with standards where you could ban a user, you could lock out users. So you could set different settings to maintain your security through AD as well. So it's really powerful. Now, single sign-on simplifies access to multiple services and resources by reducing the need to provide your credentials multiple times to access resources within Azure. It also makes upkeep easier and more transparent. So let's say, for example, you have an employee that is no longer with the company. You could use SSO to manage that associate, and you could delete it and delete that person or that device at a single point instead of doing it individually in multiple different locations. So it allows you to do clean management and control over your resources as well. Now, at the application level, such as software as a service, you could also use AD to manage your Microsoft Office 365. So it can also manage those resources and third-party applications as well. So that is SSO in general. Now, for the device, you can also register the device using Microsoft Intune. I mentioned that a brief moment ago, and you can manage it with AD as well. So, service in AD can block access to unregistered device, even if the person using the device is fully qualified or fully authorized or fully authenticated. You could block that access based on the device level. So as you could see, you could use AD to manage users, you could use it to manage your endpoints, and you can also use it to manage access to your applications as well. Now, let's take a look at multi-factor authentication. It requires the user to provide multiple sources of authentication upfront. Normally, two options is good, and they use the sources, a secondary source for security point to sign in at different interval. Something you know would be required, something you are, or something you have is also required for that. So in most instances, your cell phone, a second device, would be used as a second form to satisfy the multi-factor authentication. So this is just an overview. Once you provide your password, the second thing would be your mobile phone, or it could be your tablet or an email, and then you're able to provide secondary source. Then you're validated, and then you are given access to the particular resource that you're trying to get to. So multi-factor authentication, please remember, it's a part of the authentication process, and it can be maintained using Active Directory as well. Now let's move on and look at conditional access, either deny or grant. So this is a situation where the system would either deny you or grant you access based on your identity or the identity signal from the user attempting to gain access. So there are three pieces to this puzzle. There's the signal, the decision, and the enforcement. So let's say, for example, you try to log on to a system from a different location or an unknown location or from a new device for the first time. It creates certain signals that you could manage systematically, and your system would be able to make a decision based on the information it received from the person with the credential or the device or the application. And then there's the enforcement, where a decision is taken whether to grant or deny access to that particular resource. So that is the conditional access in Azure, and it's managed by AD as well. Now, this is done based on the user, who the user is, and a user with plenty access right might be scrutinized for more information as well. So let's say, for example, you're logging in from a different country for the first time. It might ask you for additional information to verify yourself. It might ask you something about yourself, who you are, for example, and it will use that additional information maybe just once, just as added security precaution to make sure that you are exactly who you said you are. So that again is a part of the conditional access. Again, I've covered those. So those are already covered in the AI. We use artificial intelligence to actually do that verification process as well. Okay, let's move on to the governance module in this part of the course outline. So let's look at the session objectives real quick, and we're going to do an overview on the overall with an emphasis on governance. We're going to be looking at the basic Azure role-based access control. We mentioned that briefly before. I'm also going to be talking about resource locks, and I'm going to talk about tags as well. I mentioned that briefly before. I'm going to be talking about Azure Policy. It is a part of the solution that actually drives home the broader governance structure, auditing, and control in Azure. Then I'm going to be working with governance on a wider scale and talking about Azure Blueprint as another form of security in the security posture. Then we're going to talk about the Azure Cloud Adaptation Framework and the procedures that you should follow for a successful transition into the cloud. Okay, so let's get started. This is a general overview of the broader Azure governance structure. So Azure governance is one of the pillars in the Azure management. The process of maintaining your business inside Azure, from the moment you decided that you're going to be using Azure, the process involved deployment, continuous operation, all the way through until you retire the particular product that you're going to be using in Azure. So there are a couple of pillars that you want to consider in Azure, and we want to go over them using this particular diagram. So the first one we're going to be talking about is monitor, and this is the monitoring of your application, your infrastructure, your network, your logs, analytics, and diagnostic services. So monitoring first collects and analyze data so you can audit performance, look at the health of your system, and look at availability of your resources as they are used during the process of Azure or during the life cycle. Next, we want to talk about configuration, and this has to do with updates and management, automation, scripting, and different procedures that you would use in your configuration. So configuration is a initial provisioning of resource or resources. You thrive better on having automation to provide quality and efficiency while eliminating redundancy in your process. So you're able to do this automatically or systematically. You're able to reuse process and avoid redundancies and those types of things in Azure. Next, we want to move on to the next one, which is governance, and it's the process of controlling your appliance for all your resources. Your core planning is done right there, and your strategy that should include your Azure policy and your Azure cost management. So that is a broader part of the actual governance structure. Then we move on to security, which is the managing on securing your asset, including prevention, detection, and reaction. So it's a part of your whole risk mitigation process. The Azure Security Center is your best security asset in Azure for taking a broad control over your security posture. So we're going to look at protection now, which is different from security. Protection is making sure that the data you secured is highly available for business continuity. We talk about that with redundancy and backup and durability when we talk about Azure Availability Zone and cross-region peering earlier. So this is where the actual result is, where it's coming, the pieces are coming together. You also can use Azure Site Recovery as well at this particular point. So again, we're looking at the general overall governance and the pillars that actually contribute to governance in Azure, and that's what we did right there. We have a global understanding of the entire process. Now migration is at the top, at the center, and it's a final piece, and migration is the lift and shift operation that we spoke about, where you're trying to transition into the cloud. So it's a frictionless process that you want to maintain when you migrate into the cloud from your on-premises data center. So you use your Azure Site Recovery to help you with migration of your virtual machine from both on-premises or from other cloud services providers such as Amazon Web Services, AWS. Azure Data Migration migrates data sources to Azure Data Platform as well. So now you got a general understanding, a six-pillar understanding of how the cloud actually works in the broader governance structure. So you get an understanding from the point of migration all the way around to the different pillars that will encompass the actual Azure cloud management process and total governance. So that is that in a nutshell. Let's move on and let's talk about role-based access control now. And this is about establishing and enforcing rules and policies in Azure. It's about setting procedures, setting rules, and maintaining them using role-based access control. Now, to better understand the role-based access control and what it does, it allows you to use existing roles or reuse existing roles or define new roles for yourself. So when you use role-based access control, there's a series of default rules that comes with it once you apply it to a particular resource, application, or device. So simply assigning the resources to a particular role versus having to create a role for every device. Role-based access control allow you to group those roles together, and you can assign them in groups to different individuals, such as your administrator. You could have a basic end user, a mid-tier end user, or an end user that you want to share more roles with. So it's really for you to control access to your resources based on roles and rules and responsibilities. You want to control that using assignment. So the role-based access control is primarily your security product in Azure for that particular process. Now let's look at the broader role-based access control. If you look at the diagram right here, it's talking about scope. So first you would have the defined role. So say for example an owner is a role, you would assign a person such as a admin to that particular role. So that admin can create new user, they can delete user, they can assign roles to other users, and that would be the role. The scope is actually the different types of roles and responsibilities or groups that you would have in different hierarchy. Remember we talk about management group. The management group is at the top. Then we have the subscriptions. You could have multiple subscriptions. Then we have a resource group as another form of control. And then you could apply a role to an actual resource, an actual person, an actual device, an actual application, which is at the bottom of the process. So you get an understanding. So a scope or a set of resource set is a collection of resources having a role or roles applied to them with predefined rights. So it's really grouping the resources together and making a global or a broad assignment to those resources. That's what the scope of the resource cover. And the role is the actual rule that you set up that you want to implement or you want to apply or you want to assign to a particular user, a particular group, a particular set of resource, or a particular application, or endpoint for that matter as well. So the scope would include a management group, and as you could see, the management group is at the top. It's a collection of multiple subscription. You could apply scope also to a single subscription or a single department like your dev test department, your production. You could assign it to a resource group, which is a collection of resources. So all those resources in the group would inherit the same role and the same responsibilities. Or again, you could apply it onto a single resource, meaning an endpoint, an individual, or a particular application for that matter. So that is roles. You get an understanding of roles. Now let's take a look at resource locks. Now resource locks prevent the accidental deletion or changing of resources without the user first having to confirm their action and confirming that yes, I actually want to take this action. So resource lock is an extra layer of protection that complements the Azure role-based access control policies that you would actually have in place. It's an extra level of security. If you want to delete something, you have to tell the system that I want to delete it by removing the locks or taking some other form of action that tells the system that you actually know what exactly you're doing and you're not deleting something inadvertently. So that is a part of the security process to secure resources in Azure. Now, this is a general overview of what the lock would look like in Azure and the different settings. And then you could look at the different lock level. You have cannot delete. You are only authorized to modify and use the resource, but you cannot delete it without first removing the lock if the resource is locked. So an administrator would assign a cannot delete to a particular resource, and only that administrator can remove the lock and actually remove that resource later on. Now you also have what is known as read only as is. You can read it and nothing else. You cannot delete it. You cannot do anything to it unless you're an administrator. Then you also have Azure Blueprint, which is another layer of security that is even higher than the resource lock. So Blueprint is a much harder security lock and a more hardened security posture that can prevent even an authorized person from removing locks on critical resources. So let's say you have your employee computers that does payroll. It's a computer that you always want to have. You always want to have it up. You might put resource lock on it, but that's not sufficient. An administrator can delete it with their administrator right. With Azure Blueprint, you would elevate control for it up all the way up to the CTO level or probably higher, and probably no one for that matter in the company, maybe one or two person, are able to remove that machine. So you put a blueprint over it. If the lock was removed by an administrator, it would automatically reinstate that lock and that resource would not be able to be deleted. So blueprints are for mission critical situation. It helps to protect the resource so no one should or wish to delete such a resource, and they would be alerted and they would understand that they cannot delete this resource, and furthermore they should not be deleting this resource. So Blueprint is another part of strengthening, hardening the security posture inside of Azure. Now resource tags I spoke about before, how we could use it in many different ways. Now let's look at it in detail. Resource tag is more granular way to organize resources in Azure. Tag uses metadata about resources to provide more details about a resource. So it is to complement subscription, it's to complement resource group. You can use it to complement your management group by pooling like resources together. So let's say for example you have a resource that you're managing for a particular customer, but within that those resources that you're managing within that project, there are some expenses that you don't want to offload onto the customer. You want to track those expenses. Say there are some internal expense that you would have incurred anyway and you want to isolate them. You could use tags in that matter to do that. You could also use tags, say for example you have mission critical resources that you want to do cross region replication on. You want to add an extra layer of redundancy. They are your mission critical resources. For example, the blueprint that we spoke about, you don't want to delete your computer in HR that takes care of your employees record and timesheet. You might want to use tag to make it a mission critical resource that you want to automatically isolate from every other resource. So you are able to use tag to do those things. So you could use tags in a lot of dynamic way, but the primary purpose is to help you to provide granular organization on control over any type of resource that you want inside of Azure. You can use tags dynamically in many situations, so let's go over a few. Let's say you could use tags for resource management. One way you could provide a link across various groups or platform, or owners or department, so you could manage. So again, it plays back into the entire resource management and organization structure that I spoke about. You could use it for cost management and optimization. Tags can help you assign, track, and manage budget at a granular level. Again, granular organization. Now you can use it for operations management as well. You can use tags to ID your most critical resources, your mission critical resources. So you could use them for redundancies and SLA control. Again, I spoke about that as well. So you can add tag, you could modify, you could delete resource tag with PowerShell. You could also use your CLI to do it. PowerShell if you are using Windows, CLI if you're using Android, Mac OS, Linux. You could also use Azure Resource Manager templates to apply, modify, and delete tags. You could do it through API, RESTful API over the browser, or you could do it simply with the Azure portal, the user-friendly graphical way. So you can also use Azure Policy to enforce tagging rules and convention. So below is a tag example that I'm going to show you, but I just want to talk about it using tags with Azure Policy. It will actually complement and strengthen the ability of your policy in Azure to actually put more granular control on a particular resource. Now, here are is what a tag would look like. This would be the different properties that you would have to create for a tag to be legitimate before you could use it. So it would have an app name. So you could call it special orders. So it might be your special orders that you want to track. Then you would have a cost center tag. This is saying for infrastructure, research, and development. So you have a costing tag to it. You have an owner. This is the owner. Tim would be the owner. And he would get an email around everything that has to do with that tag. Now you have an environment, so you want to do tags on your testing environment, and the impact, how impactful is this? It's an high impact. Now the resources are on a virtual machine. Everything that we're going to be applying for this value field or on this tag is going to be for virtual machines. So any virtual machine you have within that resource group or within that management group or within that tag group, you are going to apply this particular tag to it with this particular cost center and this particular special order name. So that is an example and a good overview of how you could use tags in Azure. Now, Microsoft is really big on security, and we're still talking about the broader Azure security posture here. So they're very big on security, and a lot has been thrown at you in a really quick fashion, quick manner. So we're building on the broader security in-depth structure. We're building on the strategy, and Azure Policy is a big part or a great chunk of the strategy. So we talk about the network security group and your virtual network and the in and outbound traffic and how you could control it using your firewall and settings for your protocols and your devices and your IP address. We talk about the Azure AD, and it manages your identity and it does the authentication, not just authentication, but multi-factor authentication. We talk about SSO, the single responsibility sign-on, and how you could control the user by locking them out for the incorrect password. You could also set standard for the password requirements. You'd need uppercase, lowercase, certain special characters. All those things you could do using your Active Directory. And again, if you're coming from a Windows background and you're familiar with those things, you're at home with these, you're comfortable with them in Azure, you get familiar with them. We spoke about authorization, and the role-based access control would come in for authorization. Role-based control, access control is what would really determine how much access or the leverage a particular device, a particular individual, or an application would have to other resources in Azure. And this is the role-based access control. So if you are paying attention, you see that all these resources, all these services, they're actually working together, complementing each other to harden the security posture. So the Azure Policy is a broader governance strategy that incorporates all these services and help to make the entire security posture more hardened, more rigid, and less less susceptible to vulnerabilities from hackers and unauthorized users. Okay, so they all have their very unique processes in ordering the Azure broader security posture, is what we want to understand. So now let's take a deeper look at Azure Policy. It enables you to create, assign, and manage policies that either control or audit your resources in Azure. And Azure Policy, it can manage and cover all your resources on a global scale, a wide scale, an enterprise scale. So you could use it and massively and scale it out across your entire organization. So it is there to help make sure that rules and configuration standards are not compromised. So you could set your rules and your on policy to maintain that when a virtual machine is created, you want to encrypt the drive, you want it to have a certain password, and the password must be maintained, or you need multi-factor authentication when you log in. You could set those broad rules. So once a virtual machine is created in production, those rules through your policy is automatically enforced. Now, Azure Policy can be set at the individual or the group level. We spoke about that. You could set it on a device or a group of devices. You use the scope and the role for that particular settings, and that entire process is called the initiative, or the Azure Policy comes with built-in policies, default policies that we spoke about. Now you could override those policies, and we'll talk about that later, but there are built-in default policies for most security features in Azure. Now, policies how Azure can control, for example, your virtual machine size. I just spoke about that. Your password requirement. You need upper lowercase numbers, special character. Your username cannot be your own name. It got to be something unique, that type of thing. You are able to do that with policy. You can remember tags. You could use Azure Policy to enforce them by default as well. Suppose you want to track an entire project in an entire group for a customer in the same manner we spoke about. You could use Azure Policy to ensure that any device or resource that is added to that particular group is automatically assigned to that billing tag, that cost center tag, so you could use it to track and trace your resources that you want to keep track of. So again, the Azure Policy is very, very broad. All right, let's continue and see what else we have with Azure. Okay, Azure Policy comes with built-in policy and initiative definition. Spoke about that you can apply to your storage, your blob storage, your file storage, your table storage, your queue storage. You could use it with your VNet, your networking, your subnet, your public IPs. All those you could use Azure Policy with. You could use it with your computing resources, your virtual machine. We spoke about that. You could use it with your broader security center to help implement security posture across platform, across your enterprise departments. And you could also use it for monitoring and auditing as well. We spoke about that. So you see, the Azure Policy is really a broad part of your overall governance structure. Now you could use it to monitor, evaluate, and even fix issues systematically. This is probably one of the most powerful features in Azure. So it could transparently resolve and remedy problems for you, situations that you would normally have to stop and manually attend to. So if you're a really, really large organization, you'd really appreciate this this orchestration feature within Azure Policy that would save you a lot of time and effort while protecting your organization. Now, Azure Policy functions by creating initiatives, applying them to resources, and reviewing and evaluating those resources provided by Azure. So you can always tweak, you're always tweaking, you're always fixing and trying to get your security posture perfect. Okay, so now let's look at Azure Blueprint. I mentioned it briefly. Whether it is your Cloud of Excellence team or your custodian, or whatever your plan is, Azure Blueprint is your enterprise governance compliance solution. It's a broader and a wider and a more rigid solution that you could use on top of your tags, on top of your Azure Policy to help enforce a more rigid security posture across enterprise. Azure Blueprint will manage the managers, so to speak, and it will govern the governance for you at any scale, but it is at the top of the control level. It has the strongest or furthest reaching set of control, or the broadest set of control. Azure Blueprints will eliminate the need for micromanaging policies or compliances in repeatable solutions. So if you have a situation where you have to reuse a particular solution or a particular security posture, Azure Blueprint is your solution. Now, Azure Blueprint promotes the efficiency in orchestration. Orchestration has to do with automation. So it will systematically help you out in deployment of your resource template, your ARMS template, your artifacts that we spoke about, for your packages and your deployment. So you're seeing that the Azure Blueprint is really, really a great tool. You could use it for your role assignment. When we talk about the Azure policies and the role, Azure Blueprint can help you with that at a much higher level, a more rigid level. You could use it for your policy assignment. You could use it with your Azure Resource Manager template. I just mentioned that as well. You could also use it with your resource group. So you see the Azure Blueprint as a really, really rigid and strong and far-reaching scope and far-reaching control over your resources. Now let's talk about Cloud Adaptation Framework. So the Cloud Adaptation Framework is a proven 5-step migration guide for your frictionless lift and shift in Azure, moving from on-premises into the cloud. So if you follow this adaptation framework, Azure is promising you that you would have a successful transition. So there are 5 steps for the migration guide, and it's designed to help your cloud adoption journey. The Cloud Adaptation Framework is a proven synergy that will make your adaptation journey a lot easier, a lot more efficient, and you should try to follow it. So let's take a look at the different steps that you would try to follow in your cloud adoption journey. So the first one is to define a strategy. Why are you migrating into the cloud? What is the anticipated outcome? What do you want to gain? You want to save costs, you want to cut costs, you want to do the economies of scale, you want to see if it's true. So you want to define that strategy and make sure you understand your primary purpose for wanting to migrate into the cloud. Next, you want to make a plan. You want to have your custodian or your excellence team tie goals to resources and actions, so you know what your workload is, you know what the requirements are. You want to have some definitive control over those resources and decide what type of resources you're going to need in Azure to actually execute on your goals, on your plans, on your action, so you could get the desired result that you need. Then you want to ready your organization. You want to create your landing zone with your excellence team with the required resources using the best practices, and you could set your budget at this point. You must have the resources to manage your workload after the migration. You don't want to overplan and you don't want to underplan. So that is part of what the adaptation strategy is, to help you prepare properly, so you don't under prepare or over prepare. You just get it right the first time, so you could have a seamless transition. Now you want to adopt the cloud, you want to migrate, and you want to look at innovation that you could capitalize on. So in this phase, it's a guided manner. You want to look for process improvement and ways that you could innovate on efficacy and efficiency and actually improve the overall quality of your product. So apart from having a primary goal where you want to save on costs, you could actually look for innovative ways to actually capitalize and providing better and higher quality services for your customers and your staff. Now let's look at the final piece. You want to govern and manage your cloud environment. You want to apply governance and strategies to your new environment and create measures and benchmark to advance operation and delivery. So you want to be able to be more fluid, more dynamic, more fruitful. You want your cloud environment to be governed strictly. We just spoke about the different types of governance and the different types of security structure that you could use. You could look at your security in depth and you could look at the posture. You could strengthen the different layers so you could improve the security. So you want to have good control over your overall resources once you move your resources and workload into Azure. So that is what the cloud adaptation framework is. It's a process that helps you with a seamless transition into Azure, and it's important that you understand these 5 steps and how they actually complement the migration process. Okay, so that's cloud adaptation. Let's see what else we got. Okay, so we're moving on to the compliance part of the objective. Now, let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about. We're going to explain the compliance offering that are available in Azure so you could stay compliant with rules and regulations. We're going to look at access to Microsoft privacy statement, the online service terms, and the data protection addendum to learn what personal data Microsoft collects, how they collect them, how they use them, and for what purpose, and the retention time period. You'll gain insight into regulatory standards and compliances on Azure from the Trust Center and from the Azure compliance documentations. We want to explain the capabilities that are specific to government agencies. So that's the objectives that we're going to be looking at in Azure. Now, while we are at it and we're talking about governance and compliance, I want you to be familiar with these different areas of compliance and regulations that are available. So we have regional, we have industry, we have US government, and we have global. Let's start with global. It is not practical for me to go through all these different compliance and requirements. They are present on the Microsoft site. I'll guide you and give you an insight as to where you could find them, but we can at least look at a few of them, and I'm sticking some red arrows to draw your attention to a few of these. I might be able to cover a few more, but globally, you want to be familiar with ISO 2001, 2013, 2015, or 2014. You want to be familiar with these global ISO standard. You want to be familiar with 9001, 2015. Those are very common global practices and standards that are out there. Now, for US government, you want to be familiar with CIG, is a Criminal Justice Information System Network by the FBI. In order to use that system, you have to be compliant and you have to follow their compliance. FIPS 140-2, we used it in a few examples before. You want to be familiar with that. NIST CSF, you want to be familiar with that. Both these NIST, you want to be familiar with them. When as it relates to the industry, you want to be familiar with EPA, especially if you live in the United States. It protects medical records for patients. You want to be familiar with MPPA and so on and so forth. So you want to get yourself familiar with different industry standards in different countries. Now, when we talk about regional, you want to understand especially MTCE level 3 in Singapore. It actually talks about infrastructure as a service, password as a service, and software as a service governance. So that's really one that plays into the Azure infrastructure model pyramid. So you want to look at that. So any of these compliances, I would implore you to take some time and get familiar with them, because Azure could use any of them on the exam at any time at will. So I just want to give you a broader overview, and then we're going to take a look at a few. Now, I talk about this one, CJIS. So it's a FBI Criminal Justice Information Service. The database is required to adhere to. In order for you to use the database, you are required to adhere to their standard and security policy. That's the law. Now, we talk about STAR certification. It's based on achieving international organization standard and International Electrotechnical Commission, and it is the ISO EIC 2701 that I spoke about. This certification meeting criteria specified to Cloud Control Matrix, CCM, and this certification demonstrates that that a cloud service provider is compliant in many regards. So you need to understand that one in particular. Now, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, it's HIPAA. It's a U.S. federal law that regulates patient protection, health, and information. I spoke about that one. You want to be familiar with that one, especially if you're in the U.S. The multi-tier security Singapore, I spoke about that as well. It covers software, the entire infrastructure, and I mentioned that as well. So I'm covering the ones that I talked about. The National Institute, NIST, you want to be able to understand this and what it does as well. So these regulations, these compliances, they're critical to our understanding. Now let's move over to documentation. Documentation is a big part of what Microsoft wants to drive home in the compliance feature. Now, trust and privacy. Microsoft Trust and Privacy Statement discusses what data is collected, why it is collected, and how it is used by Microsoft. I think it will also cover the retention period. The privacy statement covers all Microsoft services, include websites, applications, software, servers, and devices that are provided by Microsoft. So the Trust Center privacy statement is very important for you if you're using any of those Microsoft resources. So understand Trust Center. Now let's take a look at what else we have on the agenda. Next, we have security. Now, online service terms, OST, is a legally binding mutual agreement between Microsoft and their customer. So this is mainly for online services, mainly your Office 365 services at the software as a service level, and it covers security, data, and responsibilities for each party. So remember, when we talk about shared responsibilities, remember your online service terms is what actually iron out what your responsibilities are. We look at it visually, we try to discuss it to get an understanding, but the crux of what you need to do and know is available in your online service terms. So that is directed directly to you at your SaaS infrastructure, which is at the top of the pyramid. Now let's take a look at compliance, which is really what we're talking about in general. The Data Protection Addendum (DPA) is a refined list of terms and their definition that covers data and security in online solution. So the Data Protection Addendum covers legal compliances, data processing procedures, what you're supposed to do for certain data, self-disclosures that Microsoft are disclosing as part of their integrity and trust, data security policies, data sharing. So it will talk about the policies that Microsoft maintains. It will talk about sharing of your data, who they'll share it with, if any third party, data retention period, data deletion. You can find your data protection addendum under your licensing term and your documentation on Microsoft website. So this is really a deep end-to-end detail about your data. It covers almost all the compliances that is required in Microsoft. That's your data protection addendum. You need to understand what the different compliance documents are doing. Now, the Trust Center, again, Microsoft is really big in trust and security. The Trust Center shows off Microsoft principles and integrity around trust. This is where Microsoft is going to brag and show and boast about what their compliance standards are, who they're compliant with, what their security measures are, what their audit reports look like. The Trust Center is where they're going to show off all of those services and all those self-disclosures and all those precautions and everything that they're doing towards security. So remember that Trust Center shows off Microsoft principles and integrity around trust by displaying security, privacy, compliance records so you could come and scrutinize them. So understand the difference between the different centers. The Trust Center provides support and resources for legal and the compliance community as well. If you want to know if Microsoft is compliant in a particular field, you could come to this site and find the legal requirements and the documentation. So understand what the Trust Center is for and it's about. The Trust Center also provides in-depth information about security, privacy, and compliance offering, policies, features, and practices across Microsoft cloud products in general or across Azure product and features. Now, this is a general overview of the compliance offering where Microsoft maintains their compliances, and they're saying that they have over 90 offering about compliances. Now let's look at what else Microsoft has around compliance. Now the Azure Compliance Documentation. It's a primary source library consisting of detailed documentation on legal, regulatory, compliance, and matters about Azure. So it is similar documentation that we went over, but this is just documentation on Azure itself. So it's an Azure Compliance Documentation Center. Next, we want to look at the Actually, we're looking at the same thing. The Azure Compliance Document Center provide clients with global, up-to-date documentation that they can adopt during their implementation of their own compliance policies. So you could use these documentation in Azure, use the compliance information to help complement your compliance structure or your compliance documentation that you need to create or you need to initiate. You can view past audit reports from Azure. You could view privacy information, compliance implementation and mapping guidelines, how it was done, white papers, and analyze reports online using the Azure compliance documentation. Now let's look at the Azure Sovereign region, and the word sovereign should actually draw your attention to it. Government. Now Azure Government is a dedicated instance of Microsoft Azure services specifically targeting the US government with compliance requirement around security for the United States federal agency, state agency, local government, and their contractors. We spoke about the different form of government, US Central, the DoD, and Iowa, and I think in Virginia as well. We spoke about them. Those are example of Azure Government. Now, Azure Government offers physical isolation, dedicated servers, and physical screening and clearance for their users with the highest compliance level of level 5 DoD approval. So when you are working with the government as a contractor with Lockheed Martin building fighter jets, you have to have high security clearance. The highest level of clearance is level 5 DoD approval. The government provides, they actually do the screening and filtering of those contractors and employees. Azure wouldn't do that for them, but Azure provided an isolated, dedicated cloud service for the government that they would maintain. Azure Government Services handles data that is subjected to certain government requirements, regulation, and requirement. So it's part of their compliance strategy. They have to follow that. Now, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, FedRAMP, is an example. The National Institute of Standard Technology, NIST 800-171, Defense Industrial Base, DIB, is another compliance that they would maintain. International Traffic and Arms Regulation, ITAR. They would also look at Internal Revenue Service, IRS 1075. That's another compliance that the government would require. And then there's a Department of Defense level 4. And then there's another one, the Criminal Justice Service that we spoke about, JIS. So all these compliance and regulatory services you would have to adhere to within this dedicated sovereign region for Azure Government or the United States. Now let's take a look at China. Now there's a sovereign region for China as well. China is operated, again, we mentioned this before, by 21 ViaNet, and it is genuinely separated instance of cloud services provided in China by 21 ViaNet. Is not provided by Microsoft. According to China Telecom regulation, providers of cloud service infrastructure at the bottom and the mid-tier level must have value-added telecom permits. Now, to have those telecom permits, you also have to have 50% or more of your investment within the China region in order to qualify. So on those terms, Azure would not qualify. As a result, 21 ViaNet qualifies, and Azure provide their service through them using special licenses agreement between Microsoft and 21 ViaNet in China. So Microsoft doesn't actually do the actual service. Now, Azure 21 ViaNet provides some Azure core services in China, and all the agreement and service contracts are between China and Azure China 21 ViaNet. So they're not directly with Azure, they're through 21 ViaNet. Please understand that as it relates to China. Now, as you migrate into the cloud, there are two critical things that we must address. We're going to be looking at chapter 6 next. We have come to the end of chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at the final chapter next. So thank you for sticking around. I think we run through this chapter really fast, and we cover all the core requirements by the course outline. So I'll see you in chapter 6, I'm sorry.